They say a king can choose any woman in the kingdom, but sometimes the one woman he wants is the one everyone else is trying to hide. Emily Carter learned that lesson on the night of the winter mating ball, though at the time she was standing ankle-deep in soapy water, scrubbing copper pots in the palace kitchen while music drifted faintly from the grand ballroom above. The sound of laughter echoed through the stone ceiling, followed by the distant notes of a string quartet. Every noble family in the kingdom had arrived for the event. Young women in glittering gowns filled the palace, each hoping to catch the attention of Alpha King Alexander Blackwood. Meanwhile, Emily wore a plain gray servant's dress with sleeves rolled to her elbows and a flour stain across her apron. Heat from the ovens warmed her face, but it did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. Above her, chandeliers sparkled. Below, she stacked dirty dishes. It had been that way ever since her father died 5 years ago. Before that, she had lived in these halls as a nobleman's daughter. Afterward, her stepmother made sure everyone forgot. "Move faster," a sharp voice snapped. Emily looked up to see her stepsister Charlotte standing in the kitchen doorway. Charlotte's sapphire blue gown shimmered beneath the lantern light. Diamonds sparkled at her throat. The dress had once belonged to Emily's mother. "The ball has already started," Charlotte said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Not that it matters. No one would notice if you disappeared entirely." Several servants lowered their gazes. Nobody dared defend Emily. They all knew better. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and returned to her work. "Yes, Charlotte." Charlotte stepped closer and examined her reflection in a polished silver tray. "Imagine embarrassing the family by showing your face upstairs. Thankfully Mother had the sense to keep you here." She laughed softly. "A servant belongs in the kitchen." The words stung more than Emily wanted to admit. Not because they were new, but because part of her feared they had become true. Once, she had dreamed of dancing beneath crystal chandeliers. Once, she had imagined being seen. Now, she spent her days carrying trays and cleaning floors while others lived the life that should have been hers. Charlotte turned toward the door. "Stay here all night. If I hear that you left this kitchen, there will be consequences." Then she was gone. Silence settled over the room except for the crackling ovens and distant music. Emily stared down into the cloudy dishwater. Her reflection wavered on the surface, distorted and uncertain. Somewhere above, the Alpha King was choosing the future Luna of the kingdom. Somewhere above, young women smiled and danced beneath golden light. Emily took a slow breath and forced herself back to work. Fairy tales belonged to other girls. Girls with beauty, status, and family names that mattered. Not forgotten daughters hidden in kitchens. Yet as the orchestra swelled overhead and the palace seemed to hold its breath, Emily could not shake the strange feeling that something was about to change. She had no way of knowing that at that very moment, the most powerful man in the kingdom was walking into the ballroom, looking for someone he had never met, and becoming increasingly certain that the woman he was searching for was not among the crowd before him. Above the kitchen, crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the grand ballroom while Alpha King Alexander Blackwood stood at the center of a sea of hopeful faces. Noble daughters smiled as he passed. Wealthy heiresses adjusted jeweled necklaces. Young women from powerful families gathered every ounce of charm they possessed. Yet with every step Alexander took, the uneasy feeling inside him only grew stronger. Something was wrong. His wolf had sensed it the moment he entered the palace. At first he thought it was simply irritation. He disliked these ceremonies. Too many people pretending to be something they were not. Too many families treating marriage like a business agreement. But this felt different. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his calm expression. Not here. The thought echoed through his mind again. Not here. Lord Harrington approached with his daughter and offered a practiced smile. Your Majesty, Lady Sophia would be honored to dance. Alexander inclined his head. Politely. Sophia was beautiful. Intelligent too, according to court gossip. Yet when she extended her hand, his wolf fell completely silent. Nothing. No spark. No pull. No interest. Perhaps later, Alexander said. The disappointment on the nobleman's face was immediate. Across the ballroom, musicians continued playing while whispers spread through the crowd. Several young women straightened their shoulders as Alexander moved on. One after another, he met them. One after another, the same result followed. Nothing. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Emily carried a heavy tray of fresh pastries toward a preparation table. The kitchen had become busier as the evening progressed. Servants hurried back and forth delivering food and drinks to the celebration above. She focused on her work, trying not to think about what she was missing. Yet each burst of laughter drifting from the ballroom tightened something painful inside her chest. She carefully set down the tray and reached for another basket when a sudden warmth brushed across her skin. It felt strange. Like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. Emily paused and glanced around. The kitchen looked exactly the same. Cooks stirred soup. Bakers prepared desserts. Nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual. She rubbed her hands together and returned to work, though the sensation lingered. Upstairs, Alexander stopped walking altogether. His head turned slightly. The feeling had appeared again. Stronger this time. His heartbeat quickened. His wolf immediately rose to attention. There. Alexander frowned. The sensation lasted only a second before fading again. Not from the ballroom. Somewhere else. Somewhere lower. Lord Beaumont approached with 2 daughters. Your Majesty, perhaps you would like an introduction? Alexander barely heard him. He was listening to the strange instinct pulling at him. It felt almost like a thread. Invisible. Delicate. Yet impossible to ignore. His gaze drifted toward a side corridor leading away from the celebration. Murmurs swept through the room as the Alpha King suddenly stepped away from the assembled guests. Your Majesty, someone called. Alexander continued walking. The thread seemed stronger now. His wolf practically growled with impatience. Down a staircase. Through another corridor. Past a row of servant entrances. Confusion spread among the guards following him. No king abandoned a mating ball in the middle of introductions. Yet Alexander ignored every questioning look. Because for the first time all evening, he felt certain of one thing. The person he had come here to find was not standing beneath the chandeliers. She was somewhere beyond them, hidden where nobody thought to look. Emily lifted another basket of fresh rolls and carried it toward the serving table, unaware that the entire palace seemed to be shifting around her. The strange warmth she had felt earlier had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. Every few minutes she found herself glancing toward the kitchen entrance for reasons she could not explain. Her heart felt restless. Not frightened. Not excited. Simply restless, as though she were waiting for something she could not name. Around her, servants hurried through their duties. Trays rattled. Ovens crackled. The scent of fresh bread and roasted herbs filled the air. Yet beneath it all, Emily sensed another feeling spreading through the room. Tension. People were beginning to whisper. Did you hear? One kitchen maid murmured. The Alpha King left the ballroom. Another servant nearly dropped a stack of plates. What do you mean he left? Nobody knows. He was meeting noble families one moment, then suddenly he walked away. Emily lowered her eyes and continued arranging pastries. Court gossip had nothing to do with her. It never did. But for some reason, the news settled strangely in her chest. Above them, the music had begun to falter. Guests were talking more than dancing now. Questions spread through the palace like ripples across water. Meanwhile, Alexander moved steadily through the lower corridors. Guards struggled to keep pace behind him. The invisible pull guiding him had become stronger with every step. His wolf was fully alert now. Not restless. Certain. Every instinct told him he was getting closer. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Not perfume. Not magic. Something far rarer. Something that made his pulse quicken. A palace steward rushed forward and bowed. "Your Majesty, the guests are becoming concerned." Alexander barely slowed. "Let them wait." The steward blinked. "Wait, Your Majesty?" Alexander's gray eyes lifted. "They have waited this long. A few more minutes will not harm them." The man wisely stepped aside. Alexander continued forward. Then he stopped. The feeling struck him with such force that he actually drew a breath. Here. His wolf practically surged forward inside him. A pair of wooden doors stood ahead. Beyond them came the sounds of a busy kitchen. Alexander stared at the doors for several seconds. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Across the room, Emily reached for another tray. The moment her fingers touched the silver handle, a sudden shiver raced through her body. The tray nearly slipped from her grasp. She caught it quickly and looked around. Something had changed. Every instinct told her so. Then the kitchen doors opened. Conversation stopped immediately. One servant froze in place. Another nearly dropped a basket of fruit. Silence spread through the room. Emily looked up in confusion. At first she saw only a tall figure standing in the doorway. Then she noticed the royal crest embroidered across his dark formal coat. The silver crown. The unmistakable presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. Her breath caught. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood stood inside the kitchen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily felt her pulse stumble. For one impossible moment, the king's gaze swept across the crowded room and landed directly on her. Everything else disappeared. The noise. The servants. The palace itself. It felt as though the entire world had narrowed to that single glance. And for the first time all evening, Alexander's wolf fell completely silent. Not because it was uncertain. Because it had finally found exactly who it had been searching for. Emily forgot how to breathe. The tray in her hand suddenly felt twice as heavy, yet she barely noticed. Every servant in the kitchen stood frozen beneath the Alpha King's gaze, but Alexander seemed unaware of anyone except her. The silence stretched so long that Emily became painfully conscious of every detail. The warmth of the ovens. The faint scent of bread cooling on nearby racks. The rapid beating of her own heart. She lowered her eyes first. Not because she wanted to, but because looking directly at the king felt impossible. "Your Majesty," the head cook finally managed, bowing so quickly that several others followed suit. "We did not expect." His voice faded. Alexander's attention never left Emily. Something about the young woman standing beside a preparation table made every instinct inside him sharpen. She wore no jewels. No expensive gown. No carefully crafted smile meant to impress. Her blonde hair had been gathered into a simple braid. A flower smudge marked one sleeve of her dress. Yet she was the first person all evening who felt completely real. His wolf, which had spent hours restless and dissatisfied, was now calm. Certain. Watching her, Alexander noticed something else. She looked frightened. Not terrified of him. Frightened of being noticed. The realization unsettled him. Most people spent their lives seeking the attention of kings. This young woman looked as though she wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. Before he could speak, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. A palace steward rushed into the kitchen, followed closely by Charlotte and Lady Margaret Carter. Emily's stomach dropped. Her stepmother's expression shifted from confusion to alarm the instant she saw Alexander standing near Emily. Charlotte recovered first. She stepped forward gracefully and offered a practiced curtsy. "Your Majesty. We have been searching everywhere for you. The guests are becoming concerned." Alexander finally looked away from Emily. The sudden absence of his attention left her strangely cold. Charlotte smiled brightly. "The ball cannot continue without its guest of honor." Alexander studied Charlotte for several seconds. His wolf responded with complete indifference. Nothing. Then he glanced toward Emily again. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Lady Margaret noticed the direction of his gaze and immediately stepped forward. Forgive the inconvenience, Your Majesty. The girl is only a servant. Emily felt the words land like stones. Only a servant. The phrase should not have hurt. She had heard it for years. Yet hearing it now, in front of the entire kitchen, made her throat tighten. A servant? Alexander asked quietly. Lady Margaret smiled nervously. Yes, Your Majesty. She helps in the lower household areas. Nothing important. Several servants exchanged uncomfortable glances. They all knew that was not true. Emily had once belonged to one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom. Alexander seemed to notice the tension immediately. His grey eyes moved between Lady Margaret and Emily. What is your name? He asked. Emily blinked. For a moment she thought he was speaking to someone else. Emily, Your Majesty. Her voice emerged softer than intended. Alexander repeated it once. Emily. The simple sound of her name on his lips sent a strange shiver through her chest. Then the king made a decision that stunned everyone present. He extended his hand toward her. Come with me. The kitchen fell completely silent. Charlotte's smile vanished. Lady Margaret looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. And Emily stared at the offered hand, unable to understand why the most powerful man in the kingdom seemed determined to bring the one person nobody else wanted anyone to see. Emily stared at the king's outstretched hand as though it belonged to another world. No one had ever invited her anywhere. Certainly not a king. Around her, the kitchen remained frozen in stunned silence. She could feel Charlotte's eyes burning into her from across the room. She could feel Lady Margaret's panic growing with every passing second. Your Majesty, Lady Margaret said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh, there is no need to trouble yourself with her. Charlotte would be honored to accompany you instead. Charlotte immediately stepped forward, her jeweled gown shimmering beneath the lantern light. Of course, Your Majesty. I would be delighted. Alexander did not even glance in her direction. His gaze remained fixed on Emily. I was not speaking to Charlotte. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Emily felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. Lady Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in years, she seemed completely unsure of what to say. Come with me, Emily, Alexander repeated. His voice remained calm, but there was a certainty beneath it that made argument feel impossible. Emily swallowed hard. Every instinct told her to refuse. She was wearing a servant's dress. Her hands smelled faintly of bread dough and soap. Hundreds of nobles filled the ballroom upstairs. She did not belong among them. Yet when she looked into Alexander's grey eyes, she saw no mockery there. No pity. Only quiet determination. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Warmth rushed through her chest so suddenly that she almost gasped. Alexander seemed to feel it too. His expression changed ever so slightly, as though something inside him had settled into place. Together they walked toward the kitchen doors. Behind them, whispers exploded the moment they were gone. The journey through the corridors felt unreal. Guards stepped aside immediately. Servants stopped and stared. Emily kept her eyes lowered, certain she was dreaming. You do not have to be afraid, Alexander said quietly as they climbed a marble staircase. Emily almost laughed at the impossibility of that statement. I am standing beside the Alpha King. A faint smile touched his lips. And yet I think you are more worried about the ballroom than you are about me. Emily hesitated. Everyone important is up there. Alexander looked ahead. That depends on how you define important. The answer left her speechless. A few moments later, the grand doors of the ballroom came into view. Music had stopped entirely. Hundreds of guests waited inside. The instant the doors opened, conversation vanished. Every noble turned to stare. Emily nearly stopped walking. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Silk gowns filled the room. Powerful families lined the polished floor. And every single person was looking at her. She felt painfully aware of her plain dress. Her simple braid. The flower stain still visible near her sleeve. Somewhere near the front, Charlotte and Lady Margaret had already arrived through another entrance. Both looked horrified. Alexander guided Emily to stand beside him at the center of the ballroom. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Who is she? A servant? Why is she standing next to the king? The question spread rapidly. Emily wished the floor would swallow her whole. Then Lord Harrington stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said carefully, perhaps there has been some misunderstanding. The selection ceremony is waiting. Alexander's expression became unreadable. He looked around the room filled with noble daughters, wealthy heirs, and powerful families. Then he glanced at Emily standing beside him. For the first time all evening, he felt absolutely certain of what needed to happen next. The ballroom remained silent as Alexander surveyed the crowd. Noble families waited expectantly. Young women stood perfectly still beneath the chandeliers. Every tradition demanded that the Alpha King begin the selection ceremony. Instead, he turned toward Emily. How long have you worked in this palace? The question startled her. 5 years, Your Majesty. Murmurs immediately spread through the room. 5 years. A servant. The information seemed to confirm every assumption people had already made about her. Alexander noticed the reactions and disliked them instantly. And before that? Emily hesitated. Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her skirt. She hated speaking about the past. The memories always felt like opening an old wound. Before that, I lived here with my father. Several nobles exchanged confused glances. Alexander's attention sharpened. Your father? Lady Margaret stepped forward so quickly that it almost seemed rehearsed. Your Majesty, surely this is not important. The guests have been waiting all evening. Alexander's gaze shifted toward her. The woman immediately fell silent. Not because he raised his voice. He did not need to. The weight of his attention alone was enough. I decide what is important. Lady Margaret lowered her eyes. Emily wished she could disappear. The entire ballroom was watching. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Yet Alexander remained patient. Who was your father? He asked. Emily swallowed. Lord William Carter. This time the reaction was impossible to hide. Several older nobles gasped softly. Others turned toward Lady Margaret in shock. Everyone knew the Carter name. Lord William Carter had been one of the most respected nobles in the kingdom before his death. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. The same Lord William Carter who served on the Royal Council? Emily nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Alexander looked from Emily to Lady Margaret. Then to Charlotte. Slowly, pieces began falling into place. Interesting, he said quietly. Charlotte stepped forward before anyone else could speak. My father married Lady Margaret after Lord Carter passed away. Emily preferred a simpler life. She enjoys helping the household. The explanation sounded polished. Practiced. Too practiced. Alexander glanced at Emily. Is that true? Emily opened her mouth, then stopped. Years of being ignored had taught her one lesson above all others. Speaking rarely changed anything. But something about Alexander's expression made lying feel impossible. No, Your Majesty. The words escaped before she could stop them. Shock rippled across the ballroom. Charlotte's face immediately lost color. Alexander remained perfectly calm. Then tell me what is true. Emily's throat tightened. Every eye in the room remained fixed on her. Yet for the first time in years, someone had actually asked. Not assumed. Not dismissed. Asked. She drew a careful breath. After my father died, everything changed. The estate passed to Lady Margaret through marriage. My education stopped. My position in the household changed. Eventually I was assigned to servant duties. No accusations. No bitterness. Just simple truth. Somehow that made the words even more powerful. Alexander listened without interrupting. His wolf stirred with growing displeasure. Not because of what had happened years ago. Because Emily spoke as though she had accepted it. As though she genuinely believed she deserved no better. Around the ballroom, uncomfortable whispers grew louder. The story many people had accepted without question suddenly looked very different. Alexander studied Emily for several seconds. Then he looked toward the gathered nobles. So while the kingdom celebrated one of Lord Carter's daughters tonight, he said slowly, the other was washing dishes downstairs. Nobody answered. Nobody could. And for the first time since entering the ballroom, Alexander realized this evening was no longer about choosing a future Luna. It was about uncovering why someone had worked so hard to ensure Emily Carter would never be seen. The atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted. What had begun as a celebration now felt like a reckoning. Nobody seemed interested in dancing anymore. Nobles whispered behind raised fans. Council members exchanged uneasy looks. Lady Margaret stood perfectly still, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed her growing anxiety. Charlotte looked even worse. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was rapidly disappearing. Alexander allowed the silence to stretch. Sometimes people revealed more when they became uncomfortable. Eventually Lord Beaumont cleared his throat. Your Majesty, perhaps this is a family matter. Surely tonight's purpose should remain unchanged. Several nobles nodded eagerly. They wanted the evening restored to normal. They wanted the uncomfortable questions to disappear. Alexander's expression remained calm. The purpose of tonight is selection. His voice carried easily across the ballroom. And selection requires truth. Nobody argued. Emily wished she could vanish. Every second felt overwhelming. She had spent years learning how to avoid attention. Now she stood at the center of it. Yet beneath her embarrassment, another feeling had begun to grow. For the first time in years, someone was questioning the story she had been forced to live inside. Alexander turned toward the royal archivist standing near the council platform. Tell me, Master Ellsworth. According to the official records, who inherited Lord Carter's estate? The elderly man blinked in surprise. Then he hurriedly accepted a ledger from an assistant. Pages rustled beneath trembling fingers. Moments later his eyes widened. Your Majesty. He looked up uncertainly. The primary heir listed here is Emily Carter. The ballroom erupted. Gasps echoed beneath the chandeliers. Several nobles openly stared at Lady Margaret. Charlotte's face turned pale. Emily felt the room spin slightly. She had not seen those records since she was a child. Continue, Alexander said. Master Ellsworth swallowed. The estate remained under temporary guardianship following Lord Carter's death because the heir was underage at the time. He looked back at the document. There is no record transferring primary inheritance rights away from Miss Carter. The whispers became louder. Much louder. Lady Margaret finally stepped forward. There must be some mistake. Her voice sounded strained. I managed the estate for years. Managed, Alexander repeated. Not owned. The distinction landed heavily. Emily stared at the floor. Her hands trembled slightly. She had spent so long believing she possessed nothing that hearing otherwise felt impossible. Charlotte suddenly spoke. Even if that is true, Emily has no interest in noble responsibilities. Her smile looked forced. She has always been happier helping others. Several people looked unconvinced. Alexander glanced toward Emily. Is that true? Emily slowly lifted her eyes. The entire ballroom waited. She thought about the early mornings. The endless chores. The birthdays nobody remembered. The dreams she had stopped allowing herself to have. Then she thought about her father. The man who had once told her she was stronger than she realized. "No, Your Majesty," she said softly. "It is not." For a moment nobody moved. Then Alexander smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not dramatic. Yet somehow it transformed the entire room. Because it was the first genuine expression anyone had seen from him all evening. And when the Alpha King looked at Emily Carter, there was unmistakable pride in his eyes. In that moment, every noble in the kingdom began to understand a truth that Lady Margaret and Charlotte had feared for years. The forgotten girl standing beside the throne was never supposed to remain forgotten. The realization spread through the ballroom one person at a time. Faces that had once overlooked Emily now looked at her differently. Some appeared shocked. Others embarrassed. A few seemed genuinely pleased. Yet none of those reactions mattered to Emily as much as the fact that Alexander still stood beside her. He had not stepped away. He had not changed his mind. For reasons she still could not understand, the most powerful man in the kingdom continued to treat her as though she belonged there. Lady Margaret could feel control slipping through her fingers. Years of carefully crafted appearances were unraveling in front of the entire court. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, forcing composure into her voice, "surely there has been a misunderstanding. Emily has always been part of our family." A murmur swept through the crowd. The statement sounded hollow even before she finished speaking. Alexander remained silent. His expression revealed nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Charlotte stepped forward next. "We have always cared for her." Emily lowered her eyes. The words hurt more than open cruelty ever had. Because everyone in the room knew they were not true. She remembered birthdays spent alone. Lessons taken away. Invitations that never came. Years spent watching other people live the life she once thought would be hers. She never spoke those memories aloud. She did not need to. The truth already stood in the room with her. Master Ellsworth closed the royal ledger and bowed slightly toward the king. "According to the records, Miss Carter remains the lawful heir of her father's estate. The matter can be formally reviewed by the Royal Council." More whispers followed. Several council members nodded immediately. The legal implications were obvious. Alexander finally spoke. "Then the review will begin tomorrow." Lady Margaret visibly paled. Charlotte looked as though she might protest, but one glance from the king stopped her. Across the ballroom, many nobles were no longer watching Charlotte. They were watching Emily. Seeing her for the first time. Not as a servant. Not as an afterthought. As the daughter of Lord William Carter. As someone who had been hidden in plain sight. Emily felt overwhelmed by the attention. Yet beneath the uncertainty, something fragile began to awaken inside her. Hope. A feeling she had stopped trusting years ago. Alexander turned toward the assembled guests. This evening was meant to be a selection ceremony. The room immediately fell silent. Every noble family straightened. Every hopeful daughter held her breath. At last, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Alexander's gaze swept across the ballroom. Then it settled on Emily once more. The warmth in his expression returned. Steady. Certain. Unmistakable. "Before any selection can take place," he said clearly, "there is something every person in this room should understand." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. A person's worth is not determined by the title they wear, the clothing they own, or the place others assign them. His eyes never left Emily. Sometimes the greatest mistake a kingdom can make is failing to recognize the value standing right in front of it. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. And as Emily stood beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people who had ignored her for years, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. For several seconds after Alexander finished speaking, nobody in the ballroom moved. The silence felt larger than the palace itself. Then the king turned fully toward Emily. Every eye followed him. Every guest waited. Emily could barely steady her breathing. Nothing about this evening felt real anymore. She had started the night washing dishes in the kitchen. Now she stood beneath crystal chandeliers beside the Alpha King while the entire kingdom watched. Alexander extended his hand once more. Unlike before, there was no uncertainty in the gesture. "Emily Carter," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I came here tonight believing I would choose a future Luna from among the candidates presented before me." The crowd listened without a sound. "Instead, I discovered that the person I was searching for had never been presented at all." A ripple passed through the guests. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. Alexander continued. "I found a woman who remained kind despite being overlooked. A woman who carried herself with dignity despite being denied the position that was rightfully hers. A woman who speaks honestly even when honesty would be easier to avoid." His gaze softened. "Those qualities matter far more than titles." Emily looked down at his hand. For years she had convinced herself that happiness belonged to other people. Safer that way. Easier. Hope could be dangerous. Yet standing here, she found herself wanting to believe again. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. A smile spread across Alexander's face. This time it was impossible to miss. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. Nobles rose to their feet. Council members nodded approvingly. Even people who had doubted her moments earlier now smiled as they watched. Across the room, Charlotte lowered her gaze. Lady Margaret said nothing. Their influence had vanished beneath the truth. In the months that followed, the Royal Council completed its review. Emily's inheritance was formally restored. The Carter estate returned to its rightful heir. Yet what surprised Emily most was how little she cared about the land, the titles, or the wealth. Because she had already gained something far more valuable. She had found her voice. She no longer hid her thoughts. No longer apologized for existing. And she was no longer alone. Alexander kept every promise he made. He listened when she spoke. He sought her advice. He treated her as an equal. Together they worked to improve the kingdom, funding schools, supporting struggling families, and creating opportunities for people who had once been ignored just as Emily had been. 1 year after the mating ball, the palace hosted another grand celebration. This time Emily entered through the front doors. She wore a silver gown that reflected the light like moonlit water. Nobles bowed as she passed. Children waved excitedly. Servants smiled warmly. Not because she was the future Luna. Because they knew her heart. As the music began, Alexander offered her his hand. "Ready?" he asked. Emily laughed softly. The sound came easily now. Yes. Together they stepped onto the dance floor. And for the first time in her life, Emily was exactly where she belonged. Not hidden. Not forgotten. Not waiting to be chosen. She was seen, valued, and deeply loved. And that made all the difference.